The brutal sound of splitting seams echoed like a gunshot through the dead-quiet mercantile. A horrific, jagged tear ripped straight down the spine of the fragile white calico dress, exposing the pale, scarred skin beneath. Evangeline stood absolutely frozen in the center of the trading post, her massive, heavily muscled shoulders trembling as the delicate fabric completely surrendered against her sheer, undeniable physical power. Look at her, Elias. The cowardly mail-order groom who had summoned her across 5 brutal states, barked a cruel, mocking laugh. He pointed a trembling, disgusted finger at her towering 6'3" frame. I sent for a bride, not a beast of burden. You look like a plow horse stuffed into a flour sack. The humiliating laughter of the local townsfolk pricked her skin like hot needles. Evangeline instinctively hunched her massive shoulders forward, a deeply ingrained, lifelong habit, desperately trying to fold her immense, wild strength into a smaller, more acceptable shape. She closed her deep, sorrow-filled brown eyes, waiting for the hardwood floor to crack open and swallow her whole. But the truth behind this cruel rejection was far more complicated than anyone in that room imagined. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Elias threw his hands up in theatrical disgust, slamming his fists onto the wooden counter and demanding the trading post clerk refund his telegram fees. Evangeline remained trapped in the wreckage of the dress, the cold frontier air biting at the exposed, sun-browned skin of her broad back. Her thick, sculpted arms, honed by years of swinging heavy iron axes and felling timber, felt impossibly heavy. All her life, she had survived a brutal existence that treated her only as heavy machinery. Her staggering physical strength had saved her family's failing farm time and time again, pulling broken wagons from deep Midwestern mud when the draft horses failed. Yet, it had earned her no love. It had only earned her the reputation of a monster. She had foolishly believed the newspaper advertisement, promising a fresh start, a warm hearth, and a loyal husband. She had hoped, just this once, to be treated with the quiet dignity afforded to a woman. Instead, she was a spectacle, a circus attraction for bored frontier folk to mock. The cheap lace at her collar tore further as she took a shaky breath, the sound incredibly loud in the suffocating room. Then, the heavy timber door of the mercantile swung open, silencing the room instantly. The man who stepped out of the freezing mountain draft was a staggering force of nature. He dwarfed even Evangeline. Massively broad-shouldered, he brought the scent of crushed pine needles, wood smoke, and coming snow into the stale air of the shop. This was Callahan, a solitary giant who operated a high-altitude freight company, hauling massive timber through mountain passes where normal men perished. He wore thick, worn suspenders over a heavy, sweat-stained thermal Henley. The sleeves were torn away at the shoulders, exposing wildly muscular, dust-covered arms thick as tree trunks. He carried an aura of absolute, terrifying stillness. His striking, silver-flecked eyes swept the room. He took in the cruel groom. He took in the staring townsfolk. Finally, his gaze locked onto the towering, devastated woman shivering in the center of the floor. Elias sneered, turning his venom back to Evangeline, emboldened by the growing crowd. I ain't paying your way back east. You can walk for all I care, you giant freak. A heavy leather coin purse hit the mercantile counter with the force of an iron anvil. The sheer violence of the sudden noise made Elias flinch violently backward. Callahan did not raise his deep voice. He did not posture. He merely stepped forward, his massive frame eating up the distance in 3 long strides, stopping exactly between the cowering groom and the trembling woman. The air in the room seemed to compress around him. "Her debts are paid," Callahan rumbled, his voice resembling the slow grinding of heavy stones deep within the earth. He did not look at Elias. His hardened, weathered face remained entirely focused on the clerk behind the counter. "The stagecoach leaves in 10 minutes. Ensure that man is on it," Elias sputtered, turning pale and terrified by the towering mountain man's lethal, unmoving calm. He scrambled toward the door, clutching the heavy coin purse tightly to his chest, fleeing into the cold without daring a single look backward. The mercantile remained dead silent. The cruel mockery had vanished entirely, replaced by a suffocating, fearful awe of the giant who now occupied the center of the room. Evangeline kept her chin tucked firmly to her chest. She wrapped her thick, calloused hands around the torn edges of the calico, waiting for the new, inevitable humiliation. This man had just bought her discarded debt. He was a freight hauler. He was surely going to drag her up the mountain to chop his firewood, break his stones, and pull his carts. She braced her powerful legs, preparing for the command to move. A massive shadow fell over her. Callahan stood perfectly still before her. Slowly, deliberately, he unfastened the heavy, sheepskin-lined canvas coat from his massive shoulders. He did not shove the garment at her. He did not bark a harsh command. With quiet, painstaking reverence, Callahan stepped behind her and gently draped the immense, incredibly warm coat over her torn dress. The heavy canvas easily swallowed her massive frame. The thick sheepskin instantly chased away the biting cold, entirely shielding her exposed, heavily muscled back from the staring eyes of the townsfolk. It was a silent, impenetrable barrier erected between her dignity and the cruelty of the world. Evangeline gasped softly, the sound catching in her throat. Her wide, sorrowful eyes darted up to his weathered face. She braced herself for a look of profound disgust. She waited for his eyes to drop to her thick biceps or the broad line of her shoulders with the familiar revulsion she had known all her life. Instead, Callahan looked directly into her deep brown eyes. His gaze remained entirely composed, holding a profound, quiet respect. He did not look at her as though she were a beast of burden. He looked at her as though she were a queen who had merely misplaced her crown. "The wind is turning," Callahan murmured, his deep voice carrying a strange, resonant gentleness that directly contrasted his wild, rugged appearance. He slightly inclined his dark head toward the open door. "My wagon is outside." He turned and walked out into the freezing mud of the frontier street. He parted the crowd of onlookers simply by existing, moving with the heavy, unstoppable grace of a falling mountain. Evangeline stood perfectly still for a fraction of a second. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, beating a panicked rhythm of deep uncertainty, mixed with a terrifying spark of hope. She pulled the heavy lapels of his coat tightly across her chest. The lingering warmth of his massive body seeped deep into her frozen bones. It felt remarkably like a fortress. She lifted her chin, unhunched her powerful shoulders, and followed him, daff. Outside, a massive freight wagon stood hitched to 4 towering draft horses. The beasts looked nearly as large and wild as their master, stamping their heavy hooves in the freezing mud. The sky overhead burned with the bruised purple hue of an oncoming winter storm. Callahan stood waiting by the high wooden bench of the wagon, demonstrating infinite patience. As Evangeline approached, he did not demand she haul herself up. Instead, He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and offered his massive, heavily calloused hand. It was an act of pure, unadulterated courtesy. A gentleman's gesture offered to a woman the entire world had deemed undelicate. Evangeline hesitated, staring at his extended palm. Her own hands were incredibly large, rough and scarred from years of gripping axe handles and pulling raw ropes. She had never been helped into a carriage in her entire life. Slowly, her trembling fingers reached out, placing her strong, scarred hand into his vast grip. His hold proved impossibly firm, entirely secure, pulling her upward onto the high bench with effortless, terrifying strength. But as her weight shifted onto the wooden footboard, the calluses of her thumb brushed against something strange, tucked deep within the center of his grip. It was not splintered wood. It was not rough leather. Evangeline glanced down, her breath catching sharply in the icy mountain air. Pressed firmly into the deep, rugged lines of Callahan's rough palm, hidden entirely from the world, rested a tiny, intricate swatch of the finest, most delicate midnight blue velvet she had ever seen. Why would a solitary mountain giant, a man forged entirely of dirt, sweat, and heavy stone, be carrying something so impossibly fragile? The massive iron-banded wheels of the freight wagon ground against the freezing, deeply rutted earth with a steady, rhythmic violence. Every lurch of the heavy wooden carriage sent a jarring tremor up Evangeline's spine. Yet she remained perfectly rigid on the high bench. The sprawling frontier town slowly vanished behind them, swallowed by the dense, towering walls of blue spruce and ponderosa pine as they began their grueling ascent into the treacherous alpine pass. Beside her, Callahan sat in absolute, terrifying silence. He held the thick leather reins in his impossibly large, calloused hands with a relaxed, masterful ease, guiding the 4 colossal draft horses up the steepening incline. He did not ask her name. He did not demand an explanation for the torn calico dress or the humiliating spectacle in the mercantile. He simply existed as a massive, impenetrable wall of quiet authority beside her. Evangeline clutched the lapels of his heavy, sheepskin-lined canvas coat tighter across her chest. Beneath the thick fabric, her calloused thumb subconsciously rubbed against her own palm, haunted by the memory of the delicate midnight blue velvet she had felt hidden in his grip. The sheer contrast of that fragile fabric against a man forged entirely of dirt, sweat, and heavy stone anchored a profound, aching curiosity in her chest. A bitter, cutting crosswind suddenly whipped down the mountain gorge, carrying the icy bite of the approaching blizzard. Evangeline instinctively ducked her head, rolling her massive, heavily muscled shoulders forward in her lifelong, reflexive attempt to shrink herself. She tucked her thick arms inward, desperately trying to take up less space on the wooden bench, preparing to endure the freezing punishment of the elements. Callahan shifted his weight. He did not speak. He did not make a grand display. He simply leaned forward and subtly adjusted his towering, impossibly broad frame, deliberately placing himself between Evangeline and the brutal wind. His massive back absorbed the brunt of the icy gale entirely. The freezing air that had been biting at her face instantly vanished, replaced by the radiating, furnace-like heat of his body. Evangeline blinked, her dark, dense, sorrow-filled eyes widening slightly. Men did not shield her from the weather. Throughout her brutal, exhausting life on the failing Midwestern farm, she was the one expected to stand in the freezing rain to hold the restless livestock. She was the one expected to endure the elements because she was simply too large, too wild, and too heavily built to require gentleness. This quiet, effortless act of protection wrapped around her, like a physical blanket, easing the immediate, suffocating panic that had gripped her since the mercantile. The ascent grew significantly steeper. The massive draft horses strained against their leather harnesses, their powerful, frost-covered flanks heaving as the wagon hit a deeply washed-out section of the frozen trail. The wagon groaned, the wooden wheels spinning uselessly against slick, hard-packed ice. Evangeline immediately braced her thick, powerful legs against the footboard. Her heart began to pound a familiar, dreadful rhythm. This was it. This was the moment the illusion of safety shattered. Whenever a wagon stuck in the deep mud of the plains, her father would bark at her to get down and push. She was always the brute force required when the beasts of burden failed. She began to shrug off the heavy canvas coat, preparing to drop down into the freezing mud and throw her massive shoulders against the back of the wagon. A heavy, leather-clad arm barred her path. "Stay," Callahan murmured, the single word carrying the low, resonant vibration of distant thunder. Evangeline froze, looking up at him in sheer confusion. Callahan wrapped the reins securely around the iron brake lever. He stepped down from the high bench with the heavy, unstoppable grace of a falling boulder. Trudging through the shin-deep, freezing mud, he moved to the rear of the massive freight wagon. Without a single word of complaint, he planted his heavy mountain boots into the ice, placed his thick, tree-trunk arms against the timber frame, and pushed with earth-shattering physical power. The muscles of his massive back strained against his sweat-stained Henley. The wagon lurched forward, cresting the icy rut entirely through his terrifying strength, allowing the draft horses to find their footing once more. When he climbed back onto the bench, breathing heavily, he did not look at her with resentment. He reached beneath the wooden seat and retrieved a heavy iron canteen. Uncorking it, he wiped the rim with the back of his massive thumb and offered it to her. "Drink," he rumbled softly. "The altitude thins the blood." Evangeline took the canteen with trembling, scarred hands. The hot, heavily spiced black tea instantly flooded her freezing chest with profound warmth. She drank deeply, her throat tight with a complicated mix of awe and a strange, unfamiliar sorrow. He had recognized her overwhelming physical strength back in the town, yet he actively refused to exploit it. His silence was not the sullen, angry quiet she was used to. It was a deliberate, protective barrier constructed to give her peace. For the remainder of the agonizingly slow journey, the suffocating, emotional distance between them remained. But the sharp edges of her terror began to softly erode. She was safe in his shadow. Dusk had fully surrendered to the bruised, heavy purple of a winter night when the wagon finally leveled out onto a wide, snow-dusted plateau. Through the dense curtain of falling snow, a massive structure emerged. It was not a fragile frontier shack constructed of cheap timber. It was a staggering fortress built from immense, deeply peeled logs, nestled perfectly against the jagged face of the mountain. Golden, flickering lantern light spilled from the thick glass windows, casting long, welcoming shadows across the pristine snow. Callahan brought the horses to a halt near a sprawling, heavily reinforced timber barn. He stepped down, securing the team, before turning to offer his vast, calloused hand to Evangeline once more. This time, her hesitation was significantly shorter. She placed her massive hand in his, letting his effortless strength guide her down to the frozen earth. He led her up the wide stone steps to the cabin porch. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing a sanctuary of radiant heat and absolute stillness. Evangeline stepped over the threshold and immediately stopped dead. Her entire life, the physical world had felt entirely too small for her. She had spent decades ducking her head to pass through doorways, squeezing her wide, heavily muscled shoulders through narrow halls, and sitting gingerly on fragile wooden chairs that constantly threatened to splinter beneath her immense weight. But as she looked around Callahan's cabin, a profound sense of awe washed over her. The ceilings soared high into the darkened rafters, supported by massive, raw timber beams. The doorways were built exceptionally high and incredibly wide. The heavy iron stove in the center of the room radiated a deep, bone-soothing heat, surrounded by furniture constructed from thick, solid oak. For the very first time in her life, Evangeline stood up to her full, staggering 6'3" height. She did not have to hunch. She did not have to shrink. The space naturally accommodated her massive frame, holding her with a silent, steadfast dignity. Callahan moved past her, his heavy mountain boots making minimal sound on the wide plank floors. He lit a second oil lantern, the soft golden light illuminating the rugged, deeply weathered lines of his face. He gestured toward a short, wide hallway leading off the main room. "You need rest," he murmured gently, his silver-flecked eyes meeting hers with unwavering respect. "The room at the end is yours." Evangeline nodded slowly, clutching the front of his coat. She walked down the short hall, the sheer scale of the cabin continuing to astound her. She reached the heavy oak door at the end and pushed it open, expecting a simple cot or a rough pile of furs. The lantern light spilled into the room, and the breath entirely abandoned her lungs. She stood paralyzed in the doorway. The private bedroom was beautiful, smelling faintly of dried lavender and old, polished cedar. But it was the furniture that anchored her in sheer disbelief. The massive, heavily reinforced bed frame sat high off the floor, built long and wide enough to easily hold a woman of her towering, heavily muscled proportions. The thick, intricately stitched winter quilt folded at the foot of the mattress was vast. Even the washstand was elevated, set perfectly to the height of a giantess, preventing anyone of her staggering size from ever having to painfully stoop to wash their face. Evangeline's heart hammered a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She stepped into the room, tracing her thick fingers over the smooth, dust-free wood of the elevated washstand. This room was not a makeshift accommodation hastily prepared for an unexpected guest. Every precise measurement, every deliberate angle, and every massive piece of furniture had been meticulously crafted and positioned specifically for a woman of her exact, colossal size. And judging by the deeply settled polish on the wood, it had been waiting for her for months before Callahan ever stepped into that mercantile. How could he possibly have known she was coming? The heavy, gray light of dawn bled through the frost-rimed glass of the bedroom window, casting a pale glow across the massive cedar bed. Evangeline woke slowly, her senses entirely confused. Her entire life, morning had arrived with the biting chill of a drafty loft, the sharp ache of an unforgiving corn husk mattress, and the immediate, crushing dread of unending labor. But this morning, a profound, alien warmth enveloped her. She lay perfectly still beneath the immense, meticulously stitched winter quilt. For the first time in her 24 years of life, her toes did not hang over the edge of the footboard. The mattress beneath her did not loudly groan or sag under the sheer, heavy density of her towering, wildly muscular frame. This bed held her immense strength with absolute, silent ease. A deeply buried knot of sorrow tightened in her throat. She traced her thick, calloused fingertips over the soft linen of the pillowcase, To be accommodated, to be physically accounted for in a world built entirely for smaller, more fragile women, felt like a quiet miracle. Resting at the foot of the massive bed lay a neatly folded garment. Evangeline pushed herself up, the heavy muscles of her back shifting under the ruined, torn calico dress she had slept in. She reached for the folded fabric. It was one of Callahan's heavy, thermal flannel shirts, meticulously washed and smelling faintly of wood smoke and crushed pine. She slipped the torn calico from her broad shoulders, letting the ruined dress fall to the wide plank floor like a discarded shackle, and pulled the flannel over her head. The sleeves hung slightly long, and the broad shoulders settled perfectly over her massive, heavily sculpted biceps. It was a terrifyingly intimate comfort. The rich, deep aroma of roasting chicory root and sizzling venison drifted beneath the heavy oak door. Evangeline's stomach rumbled with a violent, hollow ache. Automatically, the lifelong conditioning of her brutal past took hold. On her father's failing Midwestern farm, she was expected to earn her meals through back-breaking sweat before the sun even crested the horizon. If she did not make herself useful, she was discarded. Panic flared in her chest. She quickly pushed her heavy arms through the sleeves, rolled them up past her thick forearms, and hurried out of the bedroom. Desperate to prove her worth before this quiet giant decided to send her back down the mountain. She stepped into the soaring, cavernous expanse of the main cabin. Callahan stood at the massive cast-iron stove, his towering, impossibly broad frame silhouetted against the roaring hearth fire. He methodically turned thick cuts of venison sausage in a heavy iron skillet, his movements possessing the slow, deliberate grace of a massive predator at rest. He wore a clean thermal Henley, the fabric straining across the sheer, staggering width of his shoulders. Evangeline immediately ducked her chin to her chest. She rolled her massive shoulders forward, aggressively curving her spine in her habitual, desperate attempt to fold her towering 6'3" frame into a smaller, less offensive shape. She crept forward on the balls of her feet, trying to silence her heavy footfalls. "I can take the skillet," Evangeline breathed, her voice a raspy, anxious whisper. She reached out with a trembling, scarred hand, attempting to slide into the narrow space beside him. "Let me earn my keep. Point me to the axe, or the water buckets. I work hard. I promise, I work hard." Callahan froze. The rhythmic sizzle of the meat seemed to deafen in the sudden, heavy silence. He slowly set the wooden spatula down. He did not turn to face her immediately. For a long, painful moment, the tension in the room thickened, thick and suffocating. Evangeline braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the harsh command, the gruff assignment of labor that would validate her miserable existence as a beast of burden. Callahan turned. His striking, silver-flecked eyes swept over her hunched, severely compressed posture. A shadow of profound, quiet sorrow crossed his rugged, weathered features. He stepped entirely away from the stove. He closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, stopping just inches away from her towering form. The radiating, furnace-like heat of his massive body blanketed her. "Look at me," Callahan murmured, his deep voice carrying the resonant, soothing rumble of a distant river. Evangeline kept her chin locked against her collarbone, her breath hitching wildly. Callahan lifted his massive, heavily calloused hand. He did not touch her face. He did not invade her space aggressively. Instead, he reached slowly behind her, placing his vast, warm palm flat against the center of her broad, heavily muscled, upper back. "You do not need to fold yourself in my home," he rumbled gently, applying a steady, grounding pressure between her shoulder blades. "Stand tall." A rogue tear broke free, tracking hotly down Evangeline's sun-browned cheek. The gentle command shattered a wall inside her chest she hadn't known existed. Slowly, agonizingly, she uncurled her spine. She rolled her massive shoulders back, expanding her wide, heavy chest, until she stood at her full, towering height. Even standing straight, she still had to look up slightly to meet his gaze. Callahan's expression held no mockery. He looked at her sheer physical power, the thick lines of her neck, and the broad sweep of her shoulders with absolute, unwavering reverence. "The world down there is too small for you," Callahan breathed, his thumb subtly stroking the heavy flannel over her spine. "But this mountain is big enough. And so is this house. You owe me no labor for your breath." Evangeline, hearing her name spoken not as a curse, but as a prayer, sent a violent shiver of warmth straight down to her heels. He removed his hand, leaving a phantom brand of heat against her spine, and gestured toward the massive oak dining table. Evangeline sat heavily on the thick, sturdy wooden chair. It did not creak. It did not groan. Callahan brought over two massive, heavy, earthenware plates piled impossibly high with roasted venison, fried eggs, and thick, buttered hearth bread. In the past, her father had berated her for eating like a farmhand, shaming her massive appetite until she learned to secretly scavenge scraps in the barn. Here, Callahan set a colossal portion before her, without a single word of judgment. He sat across from her, his own plate mirroring hers, and began to eat in comfortable, companionable silence. The emotional safety in the room felt heavy, palpable, and intoxicating. Every bite of the rich, warm food felt like a quiet absolution, slowly eroding the deep-seated shame of her own hunger. She was not a freak here. She was simply a woman breaking bread with a man who understood the sheer caloric cost of surviving in a massive, heavily muscled body. After the meal, Callahan stood, pulling on his heavy canvas coat. The winter storm outside had settled into a steady, quiet snowfall, burying the mountain pass in pristine white. "The draft horses need turning out," Callahan murmured, pulling on a pair of thick leather gloves. "The fire needs feeding." Rest. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, leaving Evangeline entirely alone in the quiet sanctuary of the cabin. She stood up, the warmth of the meal settling deeply into her bones. Despite his gentle command to rest, the lifelong urge to contribute hummed fiercely in her blood. Feeding the fire was a simple, quiet task. It was not breaking stones or hauling timber. It was simply tending the hearth. She walked over to the massive, stone-lined hearth. Beside it sat a huge, deep wooden box built directly into the floorboards to hold the split pine logs. Evangeline leaned over, her thick, powerful arms reaching deep into the very bottom of the box to retrieve the last dry pieces of kindling nestled in the corners. As her calloused fingertips scraped the bottom corner of the wooden bin, she felt a distinct, unnatural shift. One of the thick floorboards lining the bottom of the woodbox was entirely loose. Evangeline paused, her brow furrowing. She pushed the remaining woodbark aside and pressed her hand flat against the oak board. It rocked slightly on a hidden fulcrum. Curiosity, sharp and demanding, flared in her chest. She hooked her thick fingers under the heavy plank and pulled it upward. Beneath the false bottom lay a dark, perfectly hollowed-out cavity in the subfloor. Resting squarely in the center of the dust-free hollow was a heavy, rectangular iron lockbox. Evangeline held her breath. She knew she was trespassing on his privacy, but the memory of the tiny, intricate midnight blue velvet hidden in his massive palm the day before burned fiercely in her mind. Slowly, she reached down, her large hands gripping the cold iron, and lifted the box into the light of the fire. It was unlocked. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs as she carefully pushed the heavy iron lid back. The box did not contain gold, or frontier deeds, or silver coins. Instead, it was filled with dozens of thick, cream-colored parchment envelopes, meticulously bound together by a fragile silken ribbon. The edges of the paper were slightly yellowed, indicating they had been collected over a very long period of time. Evangeline gently touched the top envelope. A small, delicate swatch of midnight blue velvet, identical to the one Callahan carried in his palm, was pinned to the corner of the paper. She tilted the envelope toward the flickering light of the hearth fire, squinting to read the elegant, sweeping inkscript scrawled across the front. It was heavily stamped with international postage, returning undelivered. But it was the destination address that made the breath completely vanish from her lungs. Monsieur Laurent, Tires, Rue de la Paix, Paris, France. Evangeline stared at the elegant, foreign words, her hands trembling so violently the heavy parchment rattled against the iron box. Why was a solitary mountain giant, living in a sprawling timber fortress at the edge of the brutal frontier, sending desperate, repeated letters to a master tailor across the ocean in France? What in the world was he trying to buy? Evangeline carefully lowered the heavy iron lid, her thick fingers trembling so violently the metal clattered softly against the wooden floorboards. She hastily placed the lockbox back into the dark hollow beneath the hearth, sliding the false plank perfectly into place and scattering the loose pine bark over the seam to hide her trespass. Her massive chest heaved. The lupin, elegant French script burned in her mind. A brilliant, terrifying mystery. She stood up, her heavily muscled legs feeling strangely hollow. The silence of the cabin pressed against her ears, magnifying the erratic, thundering rhythm of her own heart. She needed cold air. She needed to ground herself in the physical world before her racing thoughts consumed her entirely. Pushing open the heavy oak door, Evangeline stepped out onto the wide, snow-swept porch. The winter storm had finally broken, leaving the mountain pass buried beneath 3 feet of pristine, blindingly white snow. The sky above was a sharp, piercing cobalt blue, entirely devoid of clouds. The freezing alpine air hit her lungs like swallowed glass, sharp and violently awakening. Across the expansive yard, near the sprawling timber barn, Callahan was already at work. Evangeline leaned against the thick porch railing, watching him with a profound, aching fascination. He was repairing the heavy loading ramp leading to the freight wagons, a structure meant to bear the colossal weight of mountain timber. He moved with a slow, devastating power. Even from a distance, the sheer tremor, staggering width of his shoulders, and the thick corded muscles of his back commanded the space. He wielded a massive steel crowbar, levering half-ton ironwood logs into place with terrifying ease. His breath plumed into the freezing air in great white clouds, a solitary giant carving his will into the frozen earth. For a long moment, Evangeline subconsciously rolled her broad shoulders forward, her lifelong habit of shrinking seizing her spine. But then, the deep, resonant echo of his voice from that morning wrapped around her mind. "You do not need to fold yourself in my home." Slowly, Deliberately, she took a deep breath, uncurled her spine, and allowed herself to stand tall on the porch, her immense frame occupying the space with quiet dignity. She walked down the wide stone steps, her thick leather boots crunching heavily through the deep, hard, packed snow. She wanted to help. She needed to feel the rough grain of wood against her calloused palms, to earn her place in this sanctuary. As she neared the barn, the sharp, percussive crack of splitting iron shattered the stillness. Callahan was guiding a massive, 12-foot ironwood beam into the high support brackets of the ramp, utilizing a thick, forged iron chain hooked to an overhead pulley. The frost had made the thick bark incredibly slick. Without warning, the frigid temperature and the colossal weight of the timber proved too much for the frozen metal. The primary iron hook sheared completely in half with the violent sound of a fired rifle. The colossal ironwood beam plummeted. It was a widowmaker. A solid, devastating mass of raw timber, falling directly toward Callahan's blind side as he reached for a secondary wedge. Evangeline did not think. She did not hesitate. The brutal instincts honed by a lifetime of hard labor and desperate survival ignited her blood. She lunged forward, her massive, wildly muscular legs tearing through the deep snowdrifts with terrifying, explosive speed. She threw her towering 6'3" frame directly into the path of the falling timber. Reaching up with her thick, sculpted arms, she planted her heavy boots deep into the frozen mud, bracing her broad back, and caught the falling ironwood beam mere inches from Callahan's skull. The staggering weight slammed into her upturned palms. The impact sent a violent, bone-rattling shockwave straight down her spine. Evangeline groaned, a deep, guttural sound of sheer exertion. The heavy fabric of her flannel shirt tore slightly at the seams as her massive biceps and thick shoulder muscles flared with unfathomable physical power. She locked her knees, her heavy boots sinking 3 inches into the frozen earth, completely halting the lethal momentum of the massive log. Callahan spun around, his striking silver-flecked eyes widening in rare, absolute shock, seeing the colossal beam hovering inches above him, suspended entirely by the staggering brute strength of the woman beside him. He immediately shifted his massive stance. He lunged under the opposite end of the ironwood, throwing his own impossibly broad shoulders against the wood. Together, the two giants bore the weight of the mountain. On 3, Callahan rumbled, his voice strained but impossibly steady. 1, 2, 3. With synchronized, earth-shattering power, they heaved the massive timber upward, guiding it safely into the heavy iron brackets of the ramp. The beam settled into place with a resounding, heavy thud that shook the frozen ground. Silence immediately flooded the yard, save for the violent, ragged sounds of their heavy breathing. Evangeline immediately stepped back, her heart plummeting into her stomach. The adrenaline evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, deeply ingrained terror. She instinctively dropped her chin to her chest and forcefully hunched her broad shoulders, desperately trying to fold her towering frame inward. She braced herself for the anger. On the Midwestern plains, whenever she had saved a farmhand from injury, the reaction was always the same: humiliated fury. Men despised being rescued by a woman. They despised her unnatural, towering strength. They felt emasculated, horrified by her thick muscles and sheer physical dominance, and they always punished her for it with cruel words and deep disgust. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for Callahan to yell, to banish her from the yard, to look at her with the familiar, crushing revulsion. Footsteps crunched softly in the snow. Callahan stepped directly in front of her. The radiating heat of his massive body enveloped her freezing skin. He did not yell. He did not posture. "Give me your hands," Callahan murmured gently. Evangeline kept her eyes squeezed shut, slowly raising her trembling, heavily calloused hands. Callahan reached out, his vast palms enveloping her thick wrists with infinite, painstaking care. He gently turned her hands over, inspecting the rough, scarred skin of her palms for splinters or torn flesh. His touch was incredibly light, a terrifyingly tender contrast to the raw physical power they had just unleashed. Finding no blood, he did not release her hands. Instead, his thick thumb gently stroked the heavy pulse point of her thick wrist, a profoundly grounding, intimate rhythm. Evangeline finally opened her deep, sorrow-filled eyes. Callahan was not looking at her with disgust. His rugged, weathered face held no bruised pride, no fragile ego, and no revulsion. Instead, as he looked at her broad shoulders, her thick arms, and the sheer, towering scale of her frame, his silver-flecked eyes were filled with raw, quiet awe. He looked at her as if she were a marvel. He revered her strength. "You are magnificent," Callahan breathed, the words carrying the heavy weight of an absolute truth. A choked sob caught in the back of Evangeline's throat. No one had ever called her magnificent. They had called her useful. They had called her an ox. But never magnificent. The deep, agonizing wound of her lifelong shame cracked straight down the middle, letting a terrifying sliver of warm light bleed into her chest. She was no longer just a rescued victim, shivering in his coat. In that frozen yard, beneath the shadow of the mountain, they had shared the yoke. They had stood as absolute equals. Callahan released her hands slowly, his gaze holding hers with a profound, unspoken promise of safety. They finished the repairs together, in companionable silence, their movements naturally aligning, a quiet dance of massive strength and mutual respect. By the time night fell, the heavy oak door of the cabin was bolted against the wind, and the iron hearth blazed with a comforting, roaring fire. Evangeline sat in the thick wooden armchair near the warmth, her massive body pleasantly exhausted. The emotional safety in the room was a palpable, heavy blanket. Callahan sat at the large dining table, a single oil lantern illuminating his rugged features. From the pocket of his heavy coat, he withdrew a small, worn leather ledger and a sharpened piece of black charcoal. Evangeline watched him quietly from the shadows of the hearth. He opened the ledger, smoothing the thick parchment pages with his calloused hand. He stared deeply into the fire for a long moment, a look of profound, aching concentration settling over his features, before he began to draw. His massive hand, capable of breaking ironwood and pulling heavy freight, moved over the paper with precise, impossibly delicate strokes. The gentle scratching of the charcoal filled the quiet cabin. Curiosity tugged at Evangeline. She slowly stood up, walking softly toward the table to retrieve her empty tea mug. As she reached for the ceramic cup, her eyes naturally fell upon the open page of the leather ledger. Her breath hitched sharply. Callahan was not charting freight routes. He was not balancing mountain timber accounts. Drawn into the center of the page, sketched with remarkable care and precise, sweeping lines, was the distinct, undeniable silhouette of a breathtaking, voluminous dress. The sketch detailed wide, elegant shoulders, a heavy, draped bodice, and a massive, sweeping train designed for a woman of towering, undeniable proportion. Beside the drawing were several tiny numbers written in French. Evangeline's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stared at the sketch, then at the rugged mountain giant quietly shading the hemline. Who in the world was he designing this beautiful, impossible dress for? The piercing, brilliant light of the high-altitude morning reflected off the 3 feet of fresh snow outside, flooding the cavernous cabin with a stark, unforgiving brightness. Evangeline sat hunched at the massive oak dining table. The ruined remnants of her white calico dress pooled in her lap. She wielded a tiny sewing needle between her thick, calloused fingers, struggling desperately to pull the frayed, cheap fabric together. It was a hopeless endeavor. The delicate stitches continuously tore through the thin cotton the moment she applied even a fraction of her natural strength. She was currently wrapped in Callahan's heavy, thermal flannel shirt, its massive proportions shielding her from the biting draft of the windows. Yet, she could not hide in his borrowed clothes forever. Winter had fully claimed the mountain pass, and the sheer, brutal reality of her situation settled heavily into her chest. She had absolutely nothing else to wear. The heavy iron latch of the front door clicked. Callahan stepped into the cabin, bringing the scent of ozone and sharp pine with him. He carried an immense armful of split ironwood, shouldering the staggering weight with the effortless, devastating power she had come to deeply admire. He crossed the wide plank floor, the heavy thud of his boots echoing in the quiet space, and deposited the timber into the wooden floor box near the hearth. As he turned, his striking silver-flecked eyes locked onto the ruined calico resting in her massive hands. Evangeline instantly dropped the needle. A hot, violent flush of deep humiliation burned up her sun-browned neck. The ghost of the cruel laughter from the mercantile echoed loudly in her ears. She instinctively rolled her wide, heavily muscled shoulders forward, curling her spine and ducking her chin in a frantic, desperate attempt to hide the sheer, towering scale of her body. Callahan remained perfectly still for a long moment. He did not look at the torn dress with pity. He did not look at her hunched posture with frustration. Slowly, he reached into the deep canvas pocket of his worn coat. He withdrew a flexible, slightly faded yellow tailor's tape. "The mountain does not forgive thin fabric," Callahan rumbled, his deep voice wrapping around her like a thick, protective blanket. He unspooled the first few inches of the yellow tape. The soft measuring ribbon draped lightly over his massive, heavily scarred fingers. "A telegraph goes out tomorrow to the winter outfitters in the Eastern Valley. They craft heavy canvas and thick wool, but they require precise numbers." Evangeline froze, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. Measurements. Her entire life, numbers had been used solely as a weapon against her. Farmhands had taken cruel bets on her weight. The town dressmaker had openly wept when forced to find enough fabric to cover her towering 6'3" frame, shouting the impossibly large dimensions across the shop for everyone to hear. To have her physical size quantified, to have the sheer width of her broad back and the heavy circumference of her sculpted biceps read aloud, felt like staring down the barrel of a loaded rifle. "I can guess," Evangeline whispered, her voice a raspy, defensive thread. She clutched the ruined calico tighter to her chest, her dark eyes wide with deeply ingrained panic. "Just order the largest they have. The men's heavy cuts. I can make them work." No, the single word was not a harsh reprimand, but a gentle, immovable anchor dropped directly into the center of her rising storm. Callahan closed the distance between them, his heavy boots moving with slow, deliberate grace. He stopped just beside her chair, the radiating, furnace-like heat of his massive body, warming her trembling shoulders. "You will not wear ill-fitting canvas meant for a man," Callahan murmured softly, the resonant vibration of his chest carrying a profound, quiet authority. "You are a woman. You deserve clothes crafted perfectly for your frame. Stand up." Evangeline, the use of her name, spoken with that same deep, unwavering reverence, slowly dismantled her terror. She released her death grip on the ruined calico. Trembling, she pushed herself up from the chair, rising to her full, towering height. Even standing straight, she still reflexively kept her wide shoulders curved inward. Callahan lifted his vast, warm hand. He placed his calloused palm gently against the center of her back, right between her heavily muscled shoulder blades. The grounding pressure was instant and deeply familiar. "Do not shrink from the tape," Callahan breathed, his silver-flecked eyes holding hers with absolute, unwavering respect. "Stand tall. Claim your space." Evangeline closed her eyes, a single, hot tear slipping past her lashes. Slowly, agonizingly, she uncurled her spine. She pushed her broad shoulders back, expanding her heavy chest, completely surrendering her towering, physically dominant form to his quiet gaze. Callahan stepped behind her. He did not rush. He did not treat the process as a cold, clinical task. The gentle slide of the flexible yellow tape across her broad, heavily muscled back felt less like a measurement and more like a quiet, deeply profound anointing. 23 inches, Callahan murmured, his voice dipping into a low, rumbling register. He did not sound disgusted. He sounded as though he were reading the magnificent, load-bearing dimensions of a sacred temple. The deep, the agonizing wound of the mercantile, the memory of the cruel groom calling her a beast of burden, began to slowly, miraculously heal under the steady, reverent touch of the mountain giant. He moved the tape to her heavy shoulders, measuring the thick, sculpted curve of her biceps through the flannel shirt. His massive fingers occasionally brushed against her warm skin, his touch impossibly light, offering a terrifyingly tender contrast to the raw, earth-shattering power held in his massive hands. 18 inches, he noted quietly, stepping slightly to the side to measure the length of her thick, powerful arms. Evangeline opened her eyes, staring straight ahead at the crackling hearth fire. A profound, entirely unfamiliar sensation began to bloom deep within her chest. It was pride. For the very first time in her brutal, exhausting existence, she did not feel like a freak of nature. She felt strong. She felt structurally magnificent. She felt perfectly safe within the towering, muscular architecture of her own body, because the man measuring it treated her flesh as if it were spun gold. Callahan knelt slowly beside her on the wide plank floor. The sheer size of him, even on one knee, was staggering. He gently grasped her heavy, scarred hand, holding it securely in his vast palm, and prepared to measure the length of her thick forearm and heavy wrist. Evangeline looked down at him, her heart swelling with an intense, suffocating warmth. She trusted him completely in this quiet, deeply vulnerable moment. Callahan looped the yellow tape around the thick, heavy bones of her wrist. His rough thumb naturally brushed against her rapidly beating pulse point. Then, everything shattered. Callahan froze. His massive frame went completely rigid. Evangeline felt the sudden, violent spike of tension radiating from his hands. The gentle, soothing rhythm of his breathing stopped entirely. He stared at the yellow numbers wrapped around her wrist, his striking silver-flecked eyes suddenly wide and completely hollowed out. A terrifying, violent tremor racked his massive shoulders. He looked exactly like a man who had just been forcefully struck in the chest by a runaway freight wagon. "Callahan?" Evangeline whispered, her voice trembling. He did not answer. The stoic mock, impenetrable mask of quiet authority that he had worn since the moment they met fractured completely, falling away to reveal a look of raw, unadulterated devastation. He dropped her hand as though it had burned him. The yellow tailor's tape slipped from his thick fingers, falling to the oak floorboards with a soft, pathetic slap. Callahan scrambled backward, his heavy boots scraping harshly against the wood. He stood up with terrifying, erratic speed, his breathing ragged and shallow. He did not look at her face. He looked wildly around the cabin, absolutely suffocated by a sudden, invisible ghost. Without a single word, without grabbing his heavy canvas coat or his leather gloves, Callahan turned and bolted for the door. He threw the heavy oak door open, the freezing alpine wind violently whipping into the warm cabin, and fled directly into the blinding, freezing whiteout of the mountain pass. Evangeline stood paralyzed in the center of the room, the lingering warmth of his touch rapidly turning to ice against her skin. She stared at the open door, the howling wind rattling the window panes, her heart breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. What terrifying memory had just broken the stoic giant's composure? The freezing alpine wind howled through the open doorway, violently whipping the flames of the hearth fire into a frantic, panicked dance. Evangeline stood entirely paralyzed in the center of the cavernous room. The biting cold slashed against her exposed, sun-browned neck. Yet, it was nothing compared to the sudden, suffocating ice forming deep within her chest. She stared at the empty doorway. The blinding whiteout of the mountain pass had swallowed Callahan whole. Slowly, heavily, Evangeline moved forward. Her thick, muscular legs felt like hollowed lead. She grasped the heavy iron latch of the oak door and pushed it shut against the howling wind. The heavy click of the metal lock dropping into place sounded like a final, devastating judgment. The silence of the cabin immediately rushed back in, thick, heavy, and absolutely crushing. On the wide plank floorboards, near the toes of her heavy leather work boots, lay the flexible yellow tailor's tape. Evangeline stared down at the discarded ribbon of numbers. A hot, violent wave of profound shame burned up her throat. She understood exactly what had just happened. For 2 days, the mountain giant had treated her with quiet dignity, shielding her from the cruel world. But the numbers had broken the illusion. The sheer, undeniable reality of her staggering physical size, the 23-inch span of her broad shoulders, the 18-inch thickness of her sculpted biceps, the heavy, dense bones of her wrists, had finally shattered his polite facade. He had seen the undeniable proof that she was not a delicate woman. The numbers had quantified her monstrosity, and the sheer disgust of it had driven him out into the freezing wilderness just to escape her towering presence. She instinctively ducked her chin to her chest. She rolled her massive shoulders forward, curling her wide spine in a desperate, deeply ingrained attempt to fold herself into nothingness. The quiet, terrifying hope that had blossomed in her chest only moments before withered instantly, turning to dry, bitter ash. Hope, she realized with agonizing clarity, was infinitely more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty was a familiar language. Cruelty was the sting of her father's heavy hand and the mocking laughter of the frontier townsfolk. But hope left a person entirely exposed. Hope stripped away the thick armor of survival. leaving the soft, vulnerable heart bare to the elements. She could not stay here. She refused to endure the humiliating pity in his striking silver-flecked eyes when the freezing cold eventually forced him back inside. She would spare them both the final, agonizing fracture of his forced courtesy, moving with mechanical, hollow efficiency. Evangeline retreated to the massive cedar bedroom. She retrieved the torn, ruined remnants of the white calico dress. It was useless as a garment, but it was the only possession she truly owned. She folded the frayed cotton in her large, calloused hands, food, the cheap fabric scratching roughly against her scarred skin. Returning to the main room, she prepared to gather the few meager supplies she would need for the brutal trek down the mountain. As she passed the heavy oak dining table, her gaze naturally fell upon the open leather ledger Callahan had left behind the previous night. The small piece of sharpened black charcoal rested precisely where he had dropped it. Beneath it, the thick parchment page lay fully exposed to the golden light of the hearth. Evangeline hesitated. The deeply ingrained fear of trespassing warred against an agonizing, starving need for answers. She slowly approached the table, her heavy boots completely silent against the wood. The sketch of the breathtaking, voluminous dress remained in the center of the page. But beneath the sweeping lines of the massive silhouette, Callahan had begun writing. The elegant, nat, looping script was deeply familiar, matching the unsent letters in the hidden iron lockbox. Much of it was written in fluid French, a language utterly foreign to her brutal Midwestern upbringing. But interspersed between the foreign words were bold, heavily pressed English translations, written in Callahan's stark, commanding hand. Evangeline braced her thick hands against the edge of the oak table. Her sorrow-filled brown eyes scanned the heavy ink, 23 inches across the shoulders. The bold script read, explicitly detailing the exact measurement he had just taken. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the cruel notes. She expected to read words like aberration, brute, or unnatural. Instead, the next line robbed the breath entirely from her lungs. The structure is magnificent. The silk must hold the weight of an absolute goddess. Reinforce the seams with double-spun thread. She carries the strength of the earth, and the fabric must not fail her. She requires a gown built not for fragility, but for immense, staggering power. Evangeline's hands began to tremble violently. A single, hot tear broke free, splashing heavily against the thick parchment, narrowly missing the charcoal silhouette. She wiped out her eyes with the back of her thick wrist, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She read the final line, heavily underlined at the bottom of the page. Pour une reine. Fit for a queen. A strangled, broken gasp tore from Evangeline's throat. It was not disgust. The violent tremor that had racked his massive frame. The hollowed-out terror in his striking silver-flecked eyes. None of it was directed at her. He had not fled into the freezing whiteout because he found her massive, heavily muscled body repulsive. He had fled because he was terrified. When his rough thumb brushed against the heavy pulse of her wrist, he had touched a ghost. Something deeply buried in his past had shattered his stoic composure, leaving him completely defenseless. The agonizing realization flooded her chest, replacing the bitter ash of shame with a roaring, undeniable fire. He revered her. He saw her towering strength as a marvel, a structural masterpiece deserving of the finest silk the world could offer. Suddenly, the golden light in the cabin vanished entirely. The large glass windows facing the mountain pass went completely black, swallowed not by the setting sun, but by a sudden, incredibly dense wall of descending clouds. The unseasonal blizzard hit the sprawling timber fortress with the sheer, devastating force of a runaway train. The massive ironwood logs groaned under the violent impact of the wind. The temperature inside the room plummeted instantly, as the chimney drafted a heavy blast of freezing air into the hearth, nearly extinguishing the fire. Evangeline spun toward the front door. Hanging casually on the heavy iron peg beside the entrance was Callahan's sheepskin-lined canvas coat. Resting on the wooden bench beneath it were his thick leather winter gloves. Panic, absolute and blinding, seized her throat. He was out there. The solitary mountain giant had bolted from the cabin, wearing nothing but a thin thermal Henley and denim trousers. The high-altitude whiteout was dropping the temperature to lethal, blood-freezing levels. Without his heavy coat, even a man of his staggering, monumental size, would freeze to death in a matter of hours. The mountain he loved so deeply was about to consume him. Evangeline did not hesitate. The lifetime of brutal instincts and desperate survival that had forged her massive body took over completely. She tore the heavy canvas coat from the iron peg. She shoved her incredibly thick, heavily muscled arms through the sleeves. The familiar scent of crushed pine and wood smoke instantly surrounding her. She grabbed his thick leather gloves, forcing them over her large, calloused hands. She retrieved the heavy iron lantern from the table, lighting the oil wick with trembling, frantic fingers. She marched to the heavy oak door and threw the iron latch. The moment she pulled the door open, the roaring and constant, blinding fury of the blizzard slammed into her towering frame. The wind screamed like a wounded animal, throwing jagged shards of ice directly into her face. The snow was already drifting halfway up the porch steps, erasing the horizon, the tree line, and every familiar landmark. To step into the storm was to invite death. Evangeline lowered her chin, uncurled her wide spine, and rolled her massive, incredibly powerful shoulders back. She was no longer a frightened bride, hiding from a cruel world. She was a giant, built for heavy burdens and impossible labor. Will she risk her life in the blinding, freezing whiteout to find the man who believed she was fit for a queen? The storm hit with the sheer, devastating violence of a physical blow. The moment Evangeline stepped off the protected porch, the blinding whiteout swallowed her completely. The freezing alpine wind screamed through the jagged mountain peaks, carrying jagged shards of ice that sliced against her exposed cheeks. The temperature plummeted so rapidly, her breath froze instantly against her collar, forming a heavy rim of frost on the thick canvas of the coat. She did not shrink from the onslaught. For the first time in her life, Evangeline consciously refused to roll her wide shoulders forward. She locked her heavy, muscular legs, anchoring her towering frame into the rising snowdrifts. Her monumental size, the very thing that had brought her a lifetime of humiliating mockery and cruel rejection, was no longer a burden. It was an undeniable, magnificent weapon against the brutal elements. She became a heavy, unstoppable force moving through the white chaos, leaning her broad chest directly into the howling gale. She swung the heavy iron lantern, its desperate golden glow barely penetrating the thick curtain of falling snow. The tracks Callahan had left were already completely erased. Buried beneath a fresh foot of powder, panic threatened to claw up her throat. But she forced it down. She focused entirely on the topography of the sprawling yard. He had bolted directly toward the tree line, fleeing into the dense, towering stand of blue spruce that bordered the mountain pass. Evangeline marched forward. The deep snow dragged at her thighs, but her wildly muscular legs pushed through the resistance with earth-shattering power. She relied on the sheer, staggering density of her body, turning herself into a human plow. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the roaring wind. It was the terrifying sound of thick timber giving way under the immense weight of the sudden ice. Evangeline snapped her head towards the sound, her sorrow-filled brown eyes squinting against the blinding snow. Through the swirling whiteout, near the edge of the dark forest, a massive shadow broke the uniform landscape. She surged forward, her breathing ragged, her thick chest heaving with exertion. At the base of a towering ancient pine, half buried in the rapidly accumulating snow, lay Callahan. A colossal, heavy bough, snapped entirely off the trunk by the violent storm, pinned the lower half of his massive body to the frozen earth. He lay horrifyingly still. The thin thermal Henley he wore offered absolutely zero protection against the lethal, blood-freezing temperature. His broad shoulders were completely covered in a thick layer of white. Evangeline threw the lantern into the snow. She dropped to her knees beside him, her massive hands frantically brushing the freezing powder from his rugged, weathered face. His striking silver-flecked eyes were closed. His skin, usually radiating a furnace-like heat, was terrifyingly cold and pale. His breathing was dangerously shallow, rattling softly in his deep chest. "Callahan," Evangeline screamed, the wind instantly tearing the desperate sound from her lips. She did not wait for a response. She grabbed the massive, ice-coated pine bough with both of her heavily calloused hands. The wood was impossibly thick, weighing hundreds of pounds, solidly wedged against his heavy mountain boots. Evangeline planted her feet deep into the freezing mud beneath the snow. She wrapped her thick, sculpted arms around the rough bark. She did not pray for help. She did not wish for a miracle. She simply drew upon the lifetime of backbreaking, grueling labor that had forged her towering frame. She threw her massive shoulders back and pulled. A guttural, then feral roar of pure physical exertion tore from her throat. The heavy muscles of her broad back flared beneath the canvas coat. Her thick biceps bulged violently, straining against the heavy fabric. The colossal weight of the frozen timber resisted, but her sheer, undeniable physical dominance refused to yield. With a sickening crunch of breaking ice, the massive bough shifted. She heaved upward, her powerful legs locking, and violently rolled the crushing timber entirely off his legs. She collapsed beside him, her lungs burning, her massive chest heaving. She did not have time to rest. The freezing wind was rapidly draining the last remnants of heat from his massive frame. Less than 30 yards away, nestled deep against the tree line, stood a small, heavily fortified timber storm shelter used for storing dry kindling. Evangeline reached under Callahan's impossibly broad shoulders. She hauled him upward, her towering frame supporting the staggering, dead weight of the mountain giant. She wrapped his heavy arm around her thick neck, anchoring her hand around his waist. Moving with brutal, desperate determination, she dragged him through the waist-deep snow, using her massive body as a shield against the biting wind. She kicked the heavy wooden door of the shelter open and pulled him inside. The small space was pitch black, smelling deeply of dry cedar and earth, but it was mercifully sealed against the screaming wind. Evangeline immediately stripped the heavy, sheepskin-lined canvas coat from her own shoulders. She wrapped it tightly around Callahan's freezing, violently shivering body, completely ignoring the biting cold that immediately attacked her own skin through the thin flannel. She fell to her knees beside him in the suffocating dark. She rubbed her large, calloused hands fiercely over his chest and arms, desperate to generate friction. "Come back," Evangeline rasped, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated terror. "You cannot leave me here. Come back." Callahan groaned. A low, shattered vibration deep in his throat. His heavy head rolled to the side. Slowly, agonizingly, his striking silver-flecked eyes fluttered open in the dim light. The stoic, impenetrable mask of quiet authority he wore like armor was entirely gone. In its place was a look of absolute, devastating vulnerability. He stared at the towering, wildly muscular woman hovering over him. He felt the terrifying, life-giving heat radiating from her massive hands. His rough, trembling fingers weakly reached out. He did not grasp her hand. Instead, his thick thumb found the heavy, steady pulse point at her thick wrist, the exact spot that had sent him fleeing into the storm. "I broke," Callahan whispered, his deep voice a jagged, fractured thread. "You are freezing," Evangeline breathed, leaning closer, attempting to block the draft from the door with her wide back. "Save your strength." "No." His fingers tightened around her wrist. A desperate, deeply anchoring grip. "You must know the numbers. I did not run from your size, Evangeline. I ran from my own terror." Evangeline froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stared down into his hollowed-out eyes. 10 years ago, I brought a bride to this mountain," Callahan rasped, his massive chest hitching with a suppressed, agonizing sob. She was delicate. She was fragile. A wisp of a thing. Exactly what the world demands a woman to be. The winter came early. The fever took her lungs. She was simply too small, too frail to survive the brutality of this altitude. I watched the mountain slowly crush her, and I could do nothing. A profound, aching silence filled the small timber shelter, broken only by the howling wind outside. "When I touched your wrist today," Callahan continued, his voice dropping to a devastated, reverent murmur, "when I felt the staggering, undeniable strength in your heavy bones, the ghost vanished. I realized you are not fragile. The mountain cannot break you. You are built of iron and earth." A hot tear spilled down Evangeline's sun-browned cheek, splashing softly against his knuckles. The deeply ingrained, agonizing wound of her lifelong shame cracked wide open, letting a brilliant, terrifying light pour in. "I fled because I realized the terrifying truth," Callahan breathed, his striking eyes locking onto hers with raw, desperate honesty. "Your magnificent, towering strength makes you the only woman who could ever truly survive by my side. And the thought of loving again, of surrendering my heart to someone who will not break, terrified me more than the cold." The paradigm of her entire existence violently shifted. Her massive frame, the heavy muscles of her broad back, the sheer physical dominance that had alienated her from humanity. It was not a curse. It was the precise, perfect architecture required to belong to this man. Evangeline did not speak. She simply shifted her massive body, pulling his violently shivering, towering frame directly against her own. She wrapped her thick, deeply muscular arms around him, pressing his head to her chest. She shared her absolute, furnace-like core heat with him, offering him the profound emotional and physical safety he had so freely given her. Callahan buried his face against her heavy shoulder, his massive arms slowly wrapping around her broad back. The trembling in his massive frame slowly began to ease as he absorbed the immovable, deeply comforting strength of her body. The heavy, emotional distance between them dissolved entirely in the dark. As the minutes stretched into hours, the adrenaline faded. The brutal cold of the shelter crept closer, pulling Callahan into a heavy, lethargic state, hovering dangerously between sleep and delirium. He clutched the heavy flannel of her shirt, his silver-flecked eyes half-closed, his breathing slowing to a deep, ragged rhythm. The letter, Callahan slurred, his words fragmented, lost in the dangerous fog of hypothermia. Evangeline tightened her grip, her wide chin resting softly against his hair. Hush. Just breathe. They telegraphed from the coast, he murmured, his thumb weakly stroking her arm. The crate is on the railway. It must not tear. The seams must hold her. Silk from Paris. Only the strongest silk for her. Evangeline stared into the pitch-black shadows of the storm shelter, her heart stopping completely. The forgotten ledger sketch and the unsent letters rushed back into her mind with terrifying clarity. What exactly was traveling across the ocean, arriving in a massive crate, destined for a giantess? The agonizing, grueling trek back from the storm shelter had passed in a terrifying blur of frozen muscle and blinding snow. By the time Evangeline kicked the heavy oak door of the cabin shut behind them, sealing out the howling whiteout, her towering frame was entirely spent. She practically carried Callahan to the thick, woven rug positioned directly before the massive iron stove. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers, but the residual heat radiating from the thick metal immediately began to melt the thick crust of ice clinging to their clothes. Evangeline collapsed to her knees on the floorboards. Her massive chest heaved, violently pulling the warm, cedar-scented air deep into her freezing lungs. Beside her, Callahan lay heavily on the rug, his breathing ragged. The lethal pallor of his skin was already slowly retreating, replaced by the violent, stinging flush of thawing flesh. She did not pause to rest. The deeply ingrained rhythm of labor and caretaking completely overtook her exhaustion. Moving with a surprising, fluid grace that belied her staggering physical size, Evangeline stripped the frozen, heavy leather mountain boots from his feet. She retrieved a small tin of strong-smelling camphor and pine pitch salve from the washstand, warming the metal container directly on the edge of the iron stove until the ointment softened into a warm, fragrant oil. Returning to his side, she poured the warm oil into the center of her massive, heavily scarred palm. She rubbed her large hands together, creating intense friction, before pressing her thick fingers deeply into the frigid skin of his forearms and hands. Her touch was utterly devoid of hesitation. For the first time in her life, she did not worry that her sheer physical power would break the person she was holding. She used the immense, heavy density of her muscular hands to forcefully drive the heat back into his deep tissue, massaging the heavy cords of muscle running along his impossibly broad shoulders. Callahan let out a low, rough groan as the agonizing pins and needles of the thaw set in. His heavy head rolled toward her. His striking silver-flecked eyes were fully open now, completely devoid of the impenetrable stoicism he usually carried. He watched her work. He watched the way her thick, sculpted biceps flexed with every deliberate movement. He watched the deep concentration entirely softening her rugged, sorrow-filled features. Slowly, heavily, Callahan lifted his massive, trembling hand. He did not stop her frantic administrations. Instead, his calloused fingertips brushed gently against the raw, wind-chapped skin of her broad cheek. His rough thumb naturally found the heavy, steady pulse point throbbing just beneath her jaw. "You did not run," Callahan murmured, his deep voice carrying the exhausted, deeply resonant rumble of shifting earth. Evangeline paused, the warm camphor oil slick on her thick fingers. She leaned subtly into the grounding, heavy weight of his palm against her face. I have spent my entire life running from people who wanted to break me. Evangeline breathed, her deep brown eyes locking onto his. Why would I run from the only man who refuses to? A profound, heavy silence settled over the cavernous cabin, broken only by the steady crackle of the reviving hearth fire and the violent howling of the storm slowly dying outside. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. The polite, protective distance that had defined their first few days together was entirely burned away by the brutal honesty of the freezing dark. In its place remained a palpable, heavy intimacy that felt both terrifying and deeply, profoundly safe. Callahan shifted his massive frame, pushing himself up until he sat completely upright against the heavy iron leg of the stove. He reached out, taking the small tin of warm salve from her hands. "My turn," he rumbled gently. Evangeline instinctively stiffened. The lifelong habit of flinching away from tender touch flared briefly in her chest. She braced her broad shoulders, preparing to tuck her chin and hide. Callahan simply waited. He did not force her. He kept his massive hands perfectly still, resting his forearms on his thick knees, offering her the absolute choice to accept his care. Slowly, deliberately, Evangeline forced her muscles to relax. She uncurled her wide, heavy spine. She rolled her massive shoulders back, allowing herself to occupy the full, towering scale of her body without shame. She scooted closer, closing the distance until their knees brushed, completely surrendering to the quiet safety of his presence. Callahan coated his vast, deeply calloused fingers in the warm oil. With infinite, painstaking reverence, he reached up and began to massage the freezing, wind-battered skin of her thick neck and broad shoulders. His massive hands were heavily scarred, built for shattering stone and hauling raw timber. Yet they moved over her flesh with a terrifyingly delicate grace. The immense, furnace-like heat radiating from his palms seeped deeply into her aching muscles. Every stroke of his thumb seemed to systematically dismantle decades of deep, agonizing humiliation. "They hooked me to the plow," Evangeline whispered suddenly, the words spilling from her lips before she could stop them. The dark, shameful secret of her past hung heavily in the warm air. Callahan's massive hands stopped moving for a fraction of a second, but he did not pull away. His deep silence urged her to continue, offering a completely judgment-free sanctuary. "When the draft horses died in the deep mud, my father did not have the coin to replace them," she rasped, her vision blurring with hot, unshed tears. She stared blankly into the dancing flames of the hearth. The rains were coming. The seeds had to be sown. He looked at my shoulders. He looked at my thick arms. And he brought the heavy leather yokes from the barn. A violent shudder, completely unrelated to the cold, racked her towering frame. "I pulled the iron blade through the frozen dirt for 3 weeks, she confessed. The deeper, agonizing wound bleeding freely into the quiet room. The neighboring farmhands watched from the fence lines. They laughed. They called me an ox. They placed cruel bets on how many acres the beast could till before sunset. I learned to fold my shoulders forward. I learned to look at the mud. I tried so desperately to shrink, just so they would stop looking at me like a monster." Callahan's thick thumb began to move again, tracing a slow, deeply grounding circle directly over the heavy muscles of her upper back. Their blindness was their ruin. "Evangeline," Callahan breathed, his deep voice thick with a raw, terrifyingly quiet fury directed entirely at the ghosts of her past. They looked at a woman possessing the sheer, magnificent strength of the earth, and they saw only a tool. They were deeply, fundamentally unworthy of your power. He shifted his position, moving entirely behind her. He wrapped his impossibly broad, heavily muscled arms completely around her towering 6'3" frame. He pulled her thick back flush against his massive, solid Dawn's chest. "You will never wear a yoke again," Callahan murmured, his deep voice rumbling directly against her ear. "You will never shrink in my home. You belong exactly as you are. Immense. Powerful. Beautiful." Evangeline let out a shattered, broken sob. The final, heavy iron wall guarding her fiercely protected heart completely collapsed. She let her massive, heavy head fall back against his shoulder. She completely surrendered her immense weight into his hold, entirely trusting his staggering physical strength to support her. For the first time in her brutal, exhausting existence, she felt perfectly proportionate. She was completely enveloped. They sat together on the thick rug for hours as the night surrendered to dawn. They shared fragmented stories of survival, of the quiet agonies of loneliness, and the deep, aching yearning for a place to finally rest. The lingering ghosts of his fragile late wife and her cruel Midwestern farm faded into the corners of the cavernous cabin, banished entirely by the radiant, palpable warmth of their shared strength. By mid-morning, the brutal howling of the blizzard finally ceased. The heavy, bruised purple clouds completely broke apart, allowing a brilliant, blindingly clear alpine sun to pierce through the frost-rimed glass of the massive windows. The sprawling timber fortress was completely buried in a pristine, silent ocean of glittering white snow. Evangeline sat perfectly still in the quiet warmth, her heavy head resting comfortably on Callahan's thick shoulder. A profound, overwhelming sense of peace settled deep into her bones. She finally belonged. The mountain had accepted her. This quiet, massive man had claimed her, not as property, but as an absolute equal. Then, the absolute silence of the mountain morning shattered. 3 sharp, authoritative knocks hammered against the heavy oak front door. The sound was jarring, violent, and entirely unnatural in the isolated high-altitude pass. The deep snowdrifts should have made the trail completely impassable for at least another week. No traveler could have survived the ascent. Callahan immediately tensed beneath her. The relaxed, tender warmth of his massive body vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying, impenetrable stillness of a predator sensing a threat. He carefully disentangled his arms from around her, rising to his feet with heavy, deliberate grace. Evangeline pushed herself up, her heart suddenly hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She smoothed her hands down the front of the heavy flannel shirt, the deep, agonizing dread returning in a sudden, cold wave. Callahan crossed the wide plank floor. He threw the heavy iron latch back and pulled the thick oak door open. Standing on the freezing, snow-swept porch, completely wrapped in heavy furs and stamping snow from his boots, stood the local frontier sheriff. He was breathing heavily, having clearly braved the deadly aftermath of the storm on snowshoes. The lawman did not offer a friendly greeting. He did not ask if they had survived the freeze. Instead, he reached into his thick leather coat and produced a heavy, officially sealed parchment envelope. He thrust the document toward Callahan's massive chest. "I am sorry." "Callahan," the sheriff muttered, his eyes darting nervously toward the towering, wildly muscular woman standing near the hearth. "But I have a legal obligation to serve this writ." Callahan did not take the envelope. He stared down at the lawman, his silver-flecked eyes turning to chips of absolute, lethal ice. "What is it?" "It is a legal summons of property retention," the sheriff answered, his voice tight with deep discomfort. He looked directly at Evangeline. Signed by a circuit judge down in the valley. Evangeline felt the blood completely drain from her sun-browned face. Her thick, heavily calloused hands began to tremble violently. Who in the valley possessed the legal authority to demand the immediate, forceful return of a giant bride? The heavy, official parchment in the sheriff's gloved hand seemed to vibrate with the sheer, suffocating weight of the words printed upon it. Callahan did not reach for it. He remained a monumental, unmoving obstacle of cold fury, his massive frame blocking the sheriff's path into the warm sanctuary of the cabin. Property retention, Callahan repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Yet the resonant depth of it made the sheriff's postures visibly waver. Explain yourself. Miller, the sheriff sighed. A ragged, miserable sound that turned to white vapor in the biting morning air. He stepped forward where sat, his eyes never leaving the floorboards, clearly terrified of the giant who now loomed over him. It is Elias, the man who abandoned the marriage contract at the mercantile. He has filed a formal claim with the circuit court. He argues that even though he refused the marriage, he paid the travel fees, the brokerage commissions, and the initial outfitter's costs for her delivery. Evangeline felt her knees weaken. A wave of nauseating cold, far more lethal than the blizzard, crashed over her. Elias, the cowardly, cruel man who had laughed at her torn dress and abandoned her to the freezing street, now wanted to recoup his investment. He claims she is an indentured laborer, not a bride, the sheriff continued, his voice cracking under the weight of his own shame. He's demanding her immediate return to the valley, to serve out the remaining months of the original labor contract he purchased through the mail order agency. He has the paperwork. Callahan. It's all perfectly legal by the letter of the territory law. The cabin fell into a silence so profound it felt as though the very earth had stopped turning. Callahan finally reached out. He took the heavy parchment from the sheriff's hand. He did not read it. His massive, calloused fingers tightened around the paper. The sound of the thick, official document crumpling loudly in the quiet space. He looked up, his striking silver-flecked eyes turning toward Evangeline. There was no pity in his gaze. There was no demand that she hide or run. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, his massive chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. Evangeline walked forward, her heavy, measured footsteps sounding like heartbeats on the wide oak floorboards. She stopped beside Callahan, her massive, 6'3" frame standing proud and unbowed. She reached out, her thick, scarred hand gripping the edge of the parchment he held. Does he think I am still the same woman who stood in that mercantile? Evangeline asked, her voice steady, low, and terrifyingly calm. She looked at the sheriff, her deep brown eyes radiating an intense, quiet power. She did not roll her shoulders forward. She did not seek to make herself smaller. She stood in her full, towering capacity, a monument to survival. I am not his property, she declared, the words ringing with absolute, undeniable conviction. I am not a plow horse to be traded or sold. I have worked for every breath I have drawn on this mountain, and I will not return to that man's service. Evangeline, the sheriff murmured, his voice laced with genuine, quiet regret. If you refuse, the judge will send the territorial marshals. They won't care about what you've endured. They only care about the written law. Let them come, Callahan rumbled, his voice so dangerously low it seemed to vibrate the very foundation of the cabin. The sheriff flinched, clutching his coat tighter to his chest. He looked at the two giants standing before him, the mountain man and the woman who had survived his peaks, and he clearly saw the futility of his mission. He had been forced to serve the writ, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of relief that he was not the one who would have to enforce it. "I will record that you have been notified," the sheriff said, already backing down the porch steps. "But you best clear out, or find a way to settle the debt. Elias is a vengeful man, and he's currently drinking hard in the valley, boasting that he's going to reclaim his beast by force." Callahan didn't wait for the sheriff to finish. He swung the massive oak door shut, the iron latch clicking with a final, echoing sound. Evangeline turned toward the hearth. She looked at the smoldering, dying embers of the fire that had kept them warm through the long, freezing night. The legal summons was a cage, a piece of paper that sought to force her back into the very yoke she had escaped. She walked to the hearth, her movements deliberate and devoid of fear. She reached down, retrieved the crumpled summons from Callahan's hand, and dropped it directly onto the glowing coals. The parchment flared instantly, curling into blackened ash as the flames consumed Elias's claim. "It is gone," Evangeline whispered, her voice a low, resonant note of absolute finality. Callahan stepped behind her, his massive arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his solid, unyielding chest. He buried his face in the thick hair at the nape of her neck, his presence a fortress of unwavering loyalty. "You burned a legal writ," Callahan murmured, his voice vibrating through her entire frame. "That changes everything." "It changes nothing," Evangeline countered, leaning back into his strength. "I was never his. I am no one's property." "He will come for you," Callahan warned, his arms tightening around her, not in possessiveness, but in protective, absolute dedication. "And he will not come alone. He will bring men who don't care for laws or justice. He will bring men who seek to break things they cannot control." Evangeline turned in his arms, her wide, sorrow-filled eyes meeting his. "Then let him come. We are on this mountain, Callahan. We know the terrain. We know the cold." She reached up, her thick, scarred hand resting against his rough, bearded cheek. "Why are you staying? You could send me away, or leave with your freight, and the risk would vanish. Why put your life at stake for a woman you barely know?" Callahan didn't answer with words. He took her hand, pressing his mouth against her calloused palm. His eyes closed in a moment of profound, aching vulnerability. "You are the only thing in this world that makes me feel like I am finally home," he confessed, his voice a ragged, raw sound. "I spent 10 years building walls of stone and silence to keep the mountain out of my heart. You broke them without even trying." The air in the cabin shifted, thick with the weight of the unspoken. The fear of the future, of the marshals, of Elias, of the violence to come, receded, replaced by a deep, terrifyingly beautiful intimacy. "We need to move the winter timber," Callahan said after a long, lingering silence, his tone shifting back to the quiet, protective authority that defined him. "The freight delivery out of the valley must happen before the mountain pass fully thaws, or we will be trapped until spring." "Then we move it," Evangeline replied, her voice firm. Together, they spent the remainder of the day preparing the massive freight wagons. The work was grueling, requiring the combined, staggering physical power of two giants to maneuver the frozen ironwood and heavy crates of supplies onto the carriages. They worked in a synchronized dance. Their immense, muscular frames moving with a fluidity that made the impossible tasks seem trivial. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, painting the snow in shades of violent, bleeding orange, Callahan stopped, his hand resting on the heavy wheel of the primary wagon. "Wait," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. Evangeline froze, her senses instantly sharpening. Far below, at the base of the mountain trail, a tiny, dark smear moved against the pristine white of the snow. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a deer. It was a small group of horses, moving with deliberate, aggressive speed toward the mountain pass. "Elias," Callahan rumbled, his hand dropping to the heavy knife sheathed at his hip. He didn't wait for the marshals. Evangeline looked at the descending dark, the distance between them and the valley narrowing with every passing minute. She felt no panic. She felt only a cold, hard resolution. She turned to Callahan, her stature towering and immovable. "He thinks he is coming to retrieve his property. He has no idea what he is walking into." "He is coming for me," she corrected, her voice echoing with the strength of the mountains themselves. "But he will have to go through us." Callahan looked at her, his eyes blazing with a mix of fierce, protective pride and a terrifying, deep love. "He will regret the day he ever looked in your direction." As the darkness swallowed the valley, the first flickering torches appeared on the trail, winding their way up the mountain like angry, glowing embers. The showdown was no longer a question of if, but when. The cabin fire roared, a small, defiant light against the encroaching shadows of the valley men. But as Evangeline watched the torches climb, a question gnawed at her, sharp and insistent. What exactly was in the crate from Paris that Callahan was so desperate to protect? And why was Elias so obsessed with finding her? If not just for the labor, but for something else entirely. The torches creeping up the mountain trail flickered, like jagged, predatory teeth against the velvety black of the night. Evangeline watched the advance from the porch, her broad shoulders unhunched, her breathing slow and controlled. Beside her, Callahan stood like a statue, carved from the mountain itself, his massive hand resting on the heavy Winchester rifle he had retrieved from the back of the cabin. He did not look at her with fear. He looked at her with a quiet, devastating admiration that made her feel more beautiful than the most delicate lace ever could. "They are bringing a pack train," Callahan murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble. 5 men. At least. They expect us to be cowering. They expect me to be a man of commerce, not a man of the mountain. They expect me to be the broken bride they left in the mercantile, Evangeline added, her voice sharp as mountain ice. They are going to be profoundly disappointed. Callahan stepped closer, his furnace-like heat pressing against her side. He reached out, his thick fingers tracing the powerful, heavy line of her jaw. "If you wish to retreat into the cellar, I will hold the porch alone." Evangeline let out a soft, mirthless laugh. She reached up, placing her massive, calloused hand over his, anchoring them together. "I have spent my life hiding. Callahan. Never again. We hold the high ground. We hold the truth. And I am tired of letting cowards dictate the terms of my life." They moved into the cabin, the heavy door thudding shut behind them. The silence inside felt charged, a precursor to the coming violence. Callahan moved to the massive, reinforced loading dock where the freight wagon sat, tethered and ready. He pulled a heavy canvas tarp away, revealing the cargo, stacks of massive, squared-off timber meant for the valley mills, and, in the center, a large, crate-like structure reinforced with iron bands. The freight must be protected, Callahan stated, his tone businesslike, yet his eyes burning with a secret, intense purpose. But you, Evangeline, are the priority. I am the priority because I am the target, she countered, walking toward the crate. She traced the cold iron banding with her fingers. Tell me, Callahan, what is in here that Elias is so desperate to seize? He didn't just come for a worker. He's risking a long, lethal climb in a blizzard for a reason. Callahan hesitated. For the first time, his stoic resolve faltered. He looked at the crate, then back at her, his silver-flecked eyes clouding with a complex, aching vulnerability. There are things in this world that are not meant to be possessed, only protected. When you see, you will understand why I could not allow him to touch a single splinter of this wood. The sound of horses whinnying at the edge of the clearing shattered the moment. Callahan moved with a predator's speed. He extinguished the lanterns, plunging the cabin into a deep, velvety darkness. He gestured for Evangeline to take the position near the heavy, reinforced shuttered window. Voices, loud and boisterous, echoed across the snow. Elias's voice was the loudest, laced with a drunken, arrogant malice. I know he's in there, Elias shouted, his voice cracking with the thin, brittle bravado of a coward. And I know the big woman is with him. She's my legal property, and I'm taking her back to pay off every cent she owes me. Callahan leaned close to Evangeline's ear. Built for holding heavy things. And she held him now. Her presence a sanctuary. You think you are cold? She breathed, pressing her forehead against his. You are the only fire I have ever known. You think you are silent. Your actions have spoken louder than any words I have ever heard. I do not want a life in the valley. I do not want a life beneath the sun. I want the mountain. And I want the man who measured me not by my usefulness, but by my majesty. She reached out and took the small velvet box from his hand. She opened it. Inside lay a simple, unadorned band of iron, not gold, not silver, but the metal of the mountain, shaped into a circle. She took his hand, sliding the iron band onto his finger. It fit perfectly. I choose you, she said, her voice echoing over the tundra. I choose this mountain. I choose the ghost life, if that is what it takes to be yours. Callahan let out a jagged, broken breath, the sound of a man who had finally put down a burden he had carried for half a lifetime. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her with a force that felt like a permanent promise. They stood together as the sun crested the horizon, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. Two giants standing at the edge of the world. But as the warmth of the embrace settled into her bones, Evangeline felt something cold against her back. The iron lockbox that Callahan had carried through the fight. The letters, she murmured against his neck. You never told me who they were for. In the beginning, Callahan pulled back, his expression turning melancholic, but peaceful. They were for my late wife. In the early days, before the grief solidified into silence, I wrote to her. I wrote about the life I hoped to build, the woman I hoped to be strong enough to deserve. I sent them to a tailor in Paris, an old friend of my mother's, asking him to keep them, to hold on to the memory of the man I wanted to be. I thought that if I kept writing, I wouldn't lose the dream. He looked at her, his eyes clear for the first time. When I saw the agency listing for you, When I saw your eyes in that photograph, I knew the dream had finally arrived. I sent the last letter, asking him to create the gown, to make the silk, as a tribute to the woman I knew I would have to be strong enough to protect. Evangeline felt the weight of his loyalty, a devotion that had spanned years of silence. She had been the dream he was waiting for, and he had been the destiny she never dared to imagine. They looked toward the northern pass. It was a long road, a ghost life of solitude and freedom. But for the first time, the future didn't look like an abyss. It looked like an invitation. They began to walk. Their footsteps synchronized, their hands interlaced. As they moved away from the ridge, a group of riders appeared on the horizon, not the marshals, but a small caravan of frontier scouts, led by the very sheriff who had served the writ. They stopped, and, watching the giants retreat, the sheriff pulled his hat from his head, a gesture of profound, begrudging respect. He didn't follow, but he watched them until they were nothing but two specks against the immense, white silence of the north. And then he turned his horse around. The valley would have its stories. They would say that the giant mountain man and his bride had perished in the storm, lost to the peaks. They would say the mountain had finally claimed its own. But as Evangeline looked back one last time at the world she was leaving behind, she felt no regret. The silk was torn. The gown was ruined. But she was whole. She was standing at the threshold of a kingdom made of ice, stone, and absolute, enduring love. Callahan stopped, turning to face her, his massive frame silhouetted by the morning sky. He knelt once more, not in fear this time, but in a gesture of absolute surrender to the life they were beginning. "The mountain is ours," he said, his voice ringing with power. "And we are finally home." Evangeline took his hand, the iron band on his finger catching the light. She was ready. She was home. And she was finally, gloriously, her own. The last shadow of the valley flickered and vanished, leaving behind only the vast, beautiful expanse of the northern wild. They walked into the white, two titans of the earth, leaving behind the ghosts and the shackles, bound by a vow that not even the mountain could break. The loop was closed. The silence was not a void, it was a promise. As the sun rose higher, painting the tundra in gold, the giant bride and her protector vanished into the vastness, leaving behind nothing but the legend of two who were finally free to be exactly who they were. The story was written. The silence was earned. And the giant bride was finally, after all the years of hiding, standing tall. The seasons on the northern tundra did not pass with the gentle transition of the valley. They arrived with the brutal efficiency of an iron blade. Years folded into one another, measured not by the ticking of clocks, but by the lengthening shadows of the peaks and the annual return of the caribou. Life in the high pass was a testament to the life they had forged. The timber fortress Callahan had built, tucked deep into the lee of a granite cliff, had grown. It was no longer just a dwelling. It was an expansive, sprawling home of solid, hand-hewn logs, meticulously crafted to accommodate their staggering, muscular frames. The doorways remained high and wide. The furniture remained reinforced and elevated, and the hearth remained the heartbeat of their existence. Evangeline stood on the wide porch, the cold wind whipping her thick, braided hair across her face. She was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in a torn calico dress, nor was she the bride who had shredded her Parisian silk against the barricade of her past. She was a woman who had walked the fire of the mountains and emerged tempered. Her muscles, honed by years of surviving the wild, were dense and powerful. The very architecture of her strength, now a source of deep, quiet pride. She wore a heavy, practical coat of thick wool and animal fur, tailored perfectly to her immense shoulders. Inside, her heart remained as tender and resilient as it had been on that first, freezing morning. Callahan stepped onto the porch, behind her. He had aged, the lines around his eyes deepening into a roadmap of their shared history, and his beard had turned the color of the mountain frost. Yet, the sheer, monolithic power of his presence remained undiminished. He moved with the same slow, deliberate grace, his hand settling comfortably at the small of her back, a gesture of ownership, of devotion, and of absolute, unwavering partnership. They stood together, looking out over their kingdom. The northern wild was a harsh, unforgiving place, but here, there were no judges, no marshals, and no ghosts. There was only the land, and the two giants who had claimed it as their own. The winter stores are full, Callahan rumbled, his voice a deep, comforting vibration that she felt in her own chest. The pass will be closed by tomorrow. We are ready, Evangeline replied, leaning into his strength. They had learned that their greatest strength was not in their ability to fight the world, but in their ability to endure it together. They had built a life out of the silence, a sanctuary where the size of their frames was never a spectacle, but a perfect, natural, harmonious fit. Every night, before the fire died, they would sit in the oversized chairs, Callahan reading aloud from the old books he had salvaged from his freight days, and Evangeline, working with the remnants of the blue silk. She had mended the gown, not to wear it for an audience, but to keep it as a reminder of the night she had realized she was a queen. It hung in the quiet of their room, a shimmering, midnight blue monument to the moment they had finally stepped out of the shadows. The valley had long since forgotten them. The legend of the giant mountain man and his bride had become a cautionary tale whispered to children, a story of two who had vanished into the white silence. But for Evangeline and Callahan, the legend was just their morning coffee, their shared labor, and the quiet, profound safety of a life lived exactly as they chose. There were no more secrets, no more letters to send, and no more shackles to break. There was only the present, anchored by the iron band on Callahan's finger, and the unwavering gaze of the woman who had walked beside him through the fire. As the first, heavy flakes of the winter snow began to fall, muffling the world in a pristine, white veil, they turned and walked back into the cabin. The door clicked shut, and the latch dropping into place, sealing them into the warmth of their own creation. The mountain had demanded everything of them, their pasts, their fears, dapper, and their old selves, but in return, it had given them a future that was wide, immense, and entirely their own. The giant bride didn't weep for the dress anymore. She didn't weep for the space she took up in the world. She sat by the fire, her hand in her husband's, and she, finally, peacefully, rested. The mountain was silent. The storm was waiting. And for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.